So we will go right into things, and it has become something of a tradition at News Tech Forum to spend one of its panels taking a look at the extraordinary work in news video storytelling that has been done over the past year. This year, the stories were never bigger and more personally impactful for viewers. So it's my pleasure to introduce four journalists whose work we are now going to take a closer look at and unpack. Fernando Hurtado is producer and editor at NBC LX. Imayan Ibanga is a senior producer and presenter at AJ Plus from Al Jazeera. Angie Lassman is a meteorologist at WTVJ, NBC's own station in Miami. And Kim Voet Potter is the news director of WDIV, the Graham-owned station in Detroit. Welcome to you all.
Thanks, glad to be here.
So we are going to start at the top with a sample of each of your work in a row, which will be the basis of our conversation that follows. We're going to show about 2 or so minutes of each piece, enough for everybody to get a flavor of the proper sense of the story and its style. Now, 3 of these stories connect to the protests we've seen play out across the country this year, and the 4th story tackles the issue of climate change. So we'll begin with this piece from Fernando, which is called "This Black Designer Makes Protest Sign Fonts Inspired by Past Civil Rights Struggles."
My name is Trey Seals, and I run Vocal Type Co. It's the last Black-owned font foundry in America. Through Vocal Type, I specialize in creating typefaces inspired by the history of minority cultures, and specifically by focusing on progressive movements. So each typeface essentially highlights a piece of history from different minority cultures. The first font I ever made through Vocal was called Martin. I call it a nonviolent typeface. It was inspired by the protest signs carried during the Memphis sanitation strike of 1968. It was Dr. King's last cause before his death that year in April. I wanted to figure out a way to diversify design. I knew I couldn't do that through the education system or changing demographics. It just made sense to start at the root of all great pieces of graphic design, typography.
Okay, next up we have Mayans Peace, which is called "Why So Many Black People Are Buying Guns."
Now, don't be locked so tight that you're like this, right? There you go, relax a little bit. There you go.
What's the most important thing a gun owner should know?
Safety. Definitely safety.
What's the most important thing a black gun owner should know?
That they have rights.
The U.S. has at least 63 million more guns than it does people, and the most civilians with firearms globally. Black people account for the highest increase of U.S. firearm sales in 2020. Some of the people you're watching are new to gun ownership and handling. Some have inherited gun culture from previous generations of family. And all of them are the legacies of Black people's lengthy and complicated relationship with bearing arms in the U.S.
One of the things that Black people wanted to acquire, along with the vote, along with land, along with education, was the right to bear arms, was the right to protect themselves and their families.
These aren't the faces we normally see or the voices we normally hear when the U.S. talks about gun rights and ownership.
How did you feel the first time you shot?
Actually empowered. It was an adrenaline rush. It was fun.
So what does it mean to be a Black gun owner in this nation?
I think society views Black gun owners in a variety of ways. I think it depends on who it is that's doing the observing.
Hey fam, I'm Imayan, and this is the story of Black gun owners in the U.S. and the first time I ever shot a gun.
Okay, next up we have a segment from Angie's video, which is called "Unprecedented," a climate check series.
Heat and drought conditions in Southeast Australia are often the product of natural weather patterns.
We saw 2 strong climate drivers affecting Australia. One of them was a positive Indian Ocean dipole, which is basically a pattern of sea surface temperatures in the Indian Ocean that causes above average temperature and below average rain in Australia.
This positive dipole was the strongest in 20 years.
We also had a negative southern annular mode at the end of the year. Basically, that caused windier than usual conditions and drier than usual conditions in New South Wales.
But then also we've actually warmed by 1 degree Celsius. So it was all those things coming together in, I guess, the perfect storm of events that really made this summer so extreme.
But these temperatures and winds and drought were amplified by a third distressing factor.
Hello, we have serious climate change going on here.
Scientists have been ringing the alarm on climate change for decades. One of the loudest modern-day voices is Dr. Michael Mann, an American climatologist, professor, and author. Mann just happened to be in Sydney on sabbatical during the record-breaking wildfire season.
It's pretty easy to connect the dots on this one. Again, we would not have been seeing such widespread, intense, and fast-spreading fires if it were not for the dryness and the heat due to human-caused climate change. Regardless of where you are now, whether it's Florida, whether it's here in Australia, the impacts of climate change are no longer subtle. We're seeing them play out in real time now, and we're already seeing the threat that they pose to us and our environment.
Great, and finally, we're going to see this piece from the WDIV newsroom in its Defenders series, the profile of a local protester.
Young Detroiters have been garnering a lot of praise for their handling of some tense situations during these protests.
One of the standouts has been a 22-year-old woman named Gabrielle Wilson. Defender Sean Lay live with a look at why this young lady's presence has been so important for protesters and police alike. Sean.
We're going to want to give people an in-depth look at exactly what she was doing. Gabrielle Wilson had never been to a protest before this week. Now she's leading them when a group came right here to Gratiot Avenue near Connor to clash with police. She led her group back downtown. She said she wanted them safe. She wants to do this differently.
This is a peaceful protest.
Local 4 Defenders taking you inside the protest where a 22-year-old from Detroit is standing out.
We're trying to do great things, and today by following the rules and following what we all believe in.
Standing out for her strong message against police brutality and her ability to keep things calm. Back here live from Detroit's east side, if you look at Stephen McGee's Instagram, he walked with Gabrielle the entire way back downtown. And so many other protesters gave Gabrielle so much flack for not confronting police or being tough enough with her protest. She says she cares nothing about that. She's passionate about her message, passionate about defending Detroit. We're live on the east side tonight. Sean Lay, Local 4 Defenders.
All right, great work, everybody. And we will have links to each of these pieces in their entirety in the story about this panel at TV News Check so everyone could see them fully themselves. Let's start with Mayans' work. You're sort of our most outlying panelist here in the sense you're not working for a traditional broadcaster. So first of all, just so everyone has a context, can you explain AJ Plus as an organization for those who may not be familiar with it? And where do your stories iterate? You know, what's your remit and who's your audience?
Yeah, absolutely. So AJ Plus is the digital video arm of Al Jazeera, which many of you know, and it is a digital first platform. It's only a few years old. I think we're like 5 or 6 years old now. And so our audience is, we think of it as millennials, and I would say Gen Z, and even those Zennials and younger Gen Xers. I would say like that's the kind of spread that we are looking for. And not only are we different in terms of this panel, as in not being a traditional broadcast form, but also where we put our stories. So currently we live only on social platforms. So my primary platform is YouTube. You could also find us on Facebook and on Instagram. And the idea was that when they started this years ago, us meeting the audience where they were, audiences, plural, where they were. And so when it comes to stories, so my role is, I'm a presenter and senior producer, and so I really just traveled the country doing stories that I think are either undercovered or untold, looking at communities and population that often don't receive the kinds of coverage that we see elsewhere, and it's something that I really enjoy.
And I should say that you're not entirely an outlier, in the sense that you came up through cable and broadcast news too before you moved over to AJ.
Yeah. Before this, I was at NBC News, working at NBCnews.com, doing breaking news video, which I really think working in that space, and I was at CNN before that and ABC News before that, working at those major networks, but in their digital spaces, I think really helped prepare me for the role that I have now and the work that we do in terms of, being able to have that speed that you have, like when you're in local or like some of these nationwide broadcasts, like Kim's Piece that I'm sure they probably turned around in that same day. I think really helps prepare you to do some of this longer term, deeper dive stuff.
Yeah, and if we have time, I want to come back to the distribution element of these these stories as well. But first, I want to talk about this one specifically. This piece is almost 14 minutes long, which would not fly on most linear broadcasts. So when you do this, what kind of latitude do you have with length? And do you have to, when you make this, do you version out other pieces, shorter pieces?
I do version out. So as I said before, my primary platform is YouTube, and I approach stories in a way because, it's not like I have an in and out time and commercial breaks that I have to worry about. I can read, write, and produce the story as a whole and like the time it takes to, get there. What's interesting is, right, like different platforms have different sensibilities. So for example, Twitter only allows you to upload 10 minutes if you're doing a long form video, and really 9:59 for those of you who don't go to Twitter, because sometimes it won't upload at 10. And so that piece, right, the original is 14 minutes long, but I did do a Twitter version of that. And so our audiences on Twitter, on Instagram, on Facebook, on YouTube aren't necessarily the same. There is some crossover, but they're not exact. And so kind of tailoring things for certain platforms. This was a piece we thought would do well on all the platforms, given the social unrest and the timing and the subject matter and also the visuals.
And this was it July that the story came out?
Yeah, I shot this in July, and then I think we put it out maybe 6 weeks later or so, maybe 6 or 8 weeks later.
So it's a fascinating topic, Black gun ownership, and I wonder what brought you to it and how long, if you could walk us through the process of how long it began from the inception of the story to ultimately its distribution on these different channels.
Yeah. So this is a story I had kind of been thinking about for quite some time, because anecdotally for years, probably starting in 2015, I was hearing of Black people buying guns, people who, wouldn't normally associate themselves with gun culture or hadn't grown up in gun culture, buying and purchasing guns. And then in this spring with COVID and the rise of social unrest, so those two things, either one of those things individually would have shown a spike in firearm sales, just naturally, that's how the US works, but the overlapping. So I was like, I wonder if there's something like deeper here. And so it was really intriguing to me, the number of Black firearm purchasers that we were seeing, particularly because when we have conversations about firearms in the US, they're very often not the faces you see. And so I was really interested to talking to this group. I highlight a Black armory owner. So it's a small Black owned business. And I think there were maybe about 70 people that day, and all of them were Black in this kind of rural space, which is not a visual that I had seen in other places. And I thought audiences would be really interested and intriguing in that. And just that intersection, yes, we have conversations in the nation about firearms and guns and how they're treated, but also what that means at the intersection of race and even sometimes gender, because we do speak with Black female firearm owners too, who have a little bit of a different perspective. And so I thought bringing that nuance to a conversation that, yes, we often see in news pieces and just in general culture, like, right, I feel like we're always talking about guns, but not the intersectionality and not with this lens and this nuance. So I was really interested in doing that. And then I had gone without any intention of shooting a gun. I had never seen a gun before this. I'd never seen a gun in real life. I'd never heard one. And somehow my photographer talked me into being able to shoot. After I was like, no, I'm not going to do it. I don't want to do it. And then, 90 minutes later, I'm learning how to shoot a gun for the first time, which I really thought would also be interesting to take the audience with me and see kind of that first person response. So when I shoot it and you see my reaction, that's 100% natural.
You can't fake that reaction you had, that first shot that you fired off. No. That was absolutely genuine and authentic. Fernando, I want to talk about your story. What a great profile subject that you landed on there. Tell us about how that story came about, how you found him.
So that story found me, the old cliche, but it did. I had previously done a story on fonts, on highway fonts, months ago at LX, and one of my friends, I guess, remembered that story. So she told me about Trace Seals. She's like a font geek. She's like, this guy's really cool. You should check him out. And yeah, sure enough, I checked out his stuff, and I hadn't seen coverage yet. So I was like, oh, this is a great story. So I reached out. And it was great working with someone who's a designer himself, because he was all in on like helping me, like giving, like he recorded himself doing a time lapse. So he was all in on the vision as well.
Yeah, well, it so lends itself to a visual and even an auditory with the typing sounds there. Just really briefly, just contextualize your career and where you came through to your place here at NBCLX, and super briefly, if you could explain to viewers what LX is.
Sure, I'll start with what LX is, which I like to describe it as like a all multi-platform outlet from the NBC-owned stations. So we have a linear product that you can watch over the air, so daily, morning and evening news. And then we also have a robust digital operation with our website and obviously our social platforms. And it's very much so, we kind of see ourselves as the R&D arm of the NBC-owned stations, experimenting with new forms of storytelling that would captivate, we hope, a younger millennial audience. And my experience has always kind of been in the hyphen between digital, social, TV, if a hyphen can go three ways. I started off with Sinclair's digital millennial news outlet. And then so that was kind of like very much half TV, half digital. Then I went over to Attention, which was very much just social video. And that was kind of like my boot camp in creating social video. So kind of similar to AJ Plus in that sense. And then now NBCLX.
And when you describe LX accurately as experimental, I would venture to say you are among the most experimental with some of the things that you've done, at least the work that I've seen, in a very experimental group. So this piece, to focus on this one, it has a very distinct sense of style and aesthetic. So how, and we don't always have that so vividly conveyed in news stories. How did you arrive on it? And can you tell us about the tools that you used to bring it together?
Yeah, so I think we've all heard of pandemic fatigue. Maybe some people are feeling it now or felt it 3 months ago. I think I also felt Zoom fatigue, and it came pretty early on where the whole world kind of reverted and moved over to Zoom rooms. You would do work and it was a Zoom room. You would watch TV. It was a big Zoom interview. And then you would go celebrate your friends' birthdays. It was also a Zoom interview. So by July, when I did this story, I was zoomed out. And I was like, if I have to like do another Zoom interview and frame it in a weird way that makes it, that it wants to pretend that it's like normal TV and that everything's normal, but it's not, it's pixelated. I was like, how about I go all in on the computer aspect of it? And I had just watched Searching, the movie, which if you've seen it, it takes place on a computer screen. So that was full credit to them. That was my inspiration. I was like, oh, what if I do that with this story? But then I was like, oh, well, I also can't spend 2 weeks designing motion graphics for this. And then QuickTime screen record came to the rescue. So I thought, oh, if I screen record all this stuff, it'll take a little bit of storyboarding and planning with the typing and making sure that I'm moving things at the right time. So it was a lot of like doing retakes. I also had to clean my desktop, which was a big feat because I'm one of those messy desktop guys. And I put everything in a folder called Fernandos expletive. It's an expletive that rhymes with hit. And I put everything in there. And I recorded everything. It was like 2 hours of recording. And then I realized you could see the folder's name, so I had to re-record. But even then, it was much shorter production time than I would have if I had to design everything from scratch. So it was just screen recording. And then obviously his interview sound bites, I kind of played into the fact that I wasn't there with him. This interview wasn't in person, so you're seeing him through the QuickTime preview. And then it was just a lot of, it wasn't one continuous take, but it was like maybe 7 different storyboard settings, I guess you could call it. And then sound I think was the biggest part that I realized after the fact. I was like, oh, this needs like good sound design. And I think that helped kind of really fully immerse you. And then adding a few adjustment layers in Premiere with effects to get that like screen, that you're looking at it through a screen. Yeah.
So what was the length of the production process from start to finish?
So after gathering all the elements, which was, a 30-minute Zoom interview, and then him sending photos of his font, like photos of his fonts in action. And surprisingly, there was a lot of stuff on Getty Images too, because at protests, people had pictures of his font, which I thought was pretty cool. So that the gathering the elements was the easy part. Production, I think once I started recording, editing, I would say like 2 days, if you could allot, like if I was working on it like the full 8 hours of my work day. Obviously I had other stuff to do, so it was probably like more of a 3-day process. But yeah, I would say 2 days in post-production.
Doing that another time, might that go faster, do you think, having framed it out once, that you could, I mean, obviously not the same structure of the story, but do you think that process would be faster?
Yeah, I mean, I think once you have the clear storyboard, what I struggled with was once I got to the font section of showing pictures of his fonts, I didn't just want to do like a slideshow. So I had to do, if you watch the piece, it lives in the Finder window on your MacBook, if you have a MacBook. So recording that, and then it was a lot of like me realizing, oh, the file names, that's the file names of the photos where I put the credit of the photographer, and then realizing, oh, I like misspelled that name, so I have to re-record everything. So once you get over that, then I think like the actual screen recording took like 2 hours, and then it's editing and splicing.
Okay. So Kim, you are with us not as the teller of the particular story that we showed, but the manager of a newsroom that's been doing a lot of creative storytelling overall this year. The Defenders piece that we've seen is one of a series. So tell us about the impetus behind that series. What kind of pieces typically, and how many pieces you produce as a part of that?
Well, it's interesting. I mean, Defenders is actually the name of our investigative franchise. But, you know, 1 hour of our investigative franchise are more like daily, if you will, investigations, or daily, not your typical run-of-the-mill stories, which is how this fit into this. And we found this year, between pick a topic, there's been an opportunity to showcase the Defenders franchise on a regular basis. And that's how we stumbled across this story. You know, as the social justice protests were taking place, she kind of fell into our lap. We actually had 3 different type of protesters here in Detroit, and luckily none of them turned violent. We had the normal protesters that just protest regularly. We had the out-of-town protesters who came in and tried to stir up a lot of trouble, but the normal protesters took care of that and kind of quashed it. And then we had people like her who were the peaceful protesters that were extremely just passionate about getting the word out and getting the message out. And they would actually, all 3 groups would start at one place, and they would disperse to 3 different areas in the city to protest.
And so the impetus there, sort of the humanization component, facet that we're
I mean, the Defenders would not handle the day of story with the protests. It was more, you know, the story that you had to dig beneath the surface, the human story, if you will, or the story that you wouldn't see anyplace else.
So I asked Mayan earlier about story length, and Kim, this one runs, I think, about 3 minutes in its entirety, which is short for the group we have here, but it's long for local news. So I wonder, how much latitude do you allow for time-wise in your stories? Or are you normally, handcuffed to brevity? Or in this very eventful year, have you been doing more experimenting with length?
In this very eventful year, we've absolutely been doing much more experimenting with length. I mean, it's ironic. This year has actually provided us with an opportunity to do tremendous storytelling. And we've been really flexible with our reporters and photojournalists, that when they feel that they really have something that needs more time, yes, 3 minutes doesn't sound long compared to everybody else in the panel, but 3 minutes is an eternity for us. And if somebody has something that they feel warrants it, absolutely, we'll give the extra time.
And do you find your audiences are receptive to longer stories? I mean, are you getting any pushback? That piece was too long, cut it down, I need a soundbite.
No, I think there's a real appetite right now this year with everything that's going on for just news, and especially local news. I mean, we've seen an enormous increase across the board, both on our broadcast and our digital usership. And I think there's an appetite out there. I think there's an appetite for good storytelling, and I think there's an appetite for really informative stories about what's happening in your community. I mean, we haven't taken any pushback, if you will, from audiences about something being too long. Maybe it's even too short. And that's where, again, the digital piece of us, of the newsroom has an opportunity to let those interviews play out on a longer scale.
So do you think this is going to be a moment where newsrooms can and should be looking at length and say, we've done this for years and years this way, but maybe this doesn't obtain anymore. Our audience is different. Do you feel that there's a sea change come because of that?
Well, I think it's a really good question. I mean, I think they could be. I think it depends, which I'm going to hedge my bet there on what the stories are. I think that, very odd way for journalists, 2020 has been a great year to get back to the basics of storytelling. I mean, let's look at 2019 or 2017 or 2007. And it was all about story count, story count, story count, keep it quick, keep it quick, keep it quick. And I think that given this year and the enormous stories that have taken place, it has given us an opportunity to get back to the basics of storytelling and really develop routines, if you will, and new practices for telling good stories. I think that we have been so enamored with story count, so enamored with technology and doing things quick and fast on a local news level that this has given us an opportunity to absolutely look at that. I mean, if I was looking at a crystal ball, I think that we're going to see this trend, at least on a local scale, continuing for some time.
And do your reporters feel like they have the license to now be more expansive? Do you sort of have to say that to them explicitly, or is it just sort of something that's generally understood? How does that get conveyed in your newsroom?
I think it really depends on the story. I mean, I think that when you look at some of the bigger topics that have taken place right now, for instance, right now with COVID and the vaccine and what have you, I think that in our newsroom, for instance, we have discussions about, how should we approach it? Length, character development, if you will, or subject development. So I really think it depends on the story, Michael, that as opposed to just laying out a blanket rule. And I think it's really critical that as news managers, producers, reporters, photographers, you have those discussions about how long should something be, how the focus of something, rather than just having a blanket statement out there.
Mm-hmm. Angie, you are a meteorologist in Miami, a city that keeps you very busy with the prospect of extreme, existentially threatening weather. But meteorology and climatology are very different things. So how is it that you came to start reporting on the latter?
There's a couple parts to this. The first one, I suppose, is just I saw the writing on the wall. Yes, I went to school for meteorology. That was my focus, but it's hard to be in the meteorology field right now and not get inundated with stuff that has to do with climatology. So my focus, of course, wasn't climate in school, but as I started my career, I saw all of the, I don't want to say headlines because they weren't making big news, but a lot of the research that colleagues that I had gone to school with, or people that I know also on the research end of things in meteorology, they were coming out with these headlines for them that were jarring. And I didn't think that they were really being covered. And, I lived previously close to Kansas City and nobody was doing those stories there. So I kind of started to get my feet wet with it and try and tell some of those stories. And then obviously when I came to Miami, just as you mentioned, it's a city where there are tons of stories to tell when it relates to climate change. And so I started to do that. I also had the understanding that most, the average person, they don't interact with scientists on a daily basis. And a lot of them are interacting with the weather person on their TV screen. So I found that I also had a platform to kind of talk about these things that were important and that I realized weren't being covered and were really important and needed to be covered. So that's how I started to do it. And then, NBC has been great with it and given me a lot of freedom in telling a lot of different stories in many different aspects.
And they sent you to Australia to do this piece. Last year, I had somebody on the panel who took a climate change skeptic to Alaska And I think you went much further in Australia to do your reporting. So how did you convince the leadership of your station or a corporate to do this? What was your pitch to them?
You know, it's funny because I pitched it, but I really pitched it almost as okay, they're never going to say yes to this. I just mentioned it to my executive producer. You know, he was in charge of weather. And I said, hey, do you think, like, what do I have to do to be sent to Australia to cover the bushfires? And he was like, just ask. So then we did. We made a plan. He told me to put together, a pitch, and he and I got together and we did that. We took it to my news director, and she was like, well, let me take it to the general manager. And George Carvalho, he is our general manager, and he had just taken over, and he said yes in, I think, 2 days. I don't think it was a very long time that it took for him to decide that he was going to give the green light on that. And then just days later, I want to say 4 days or so after we got approved, I was already on a plane to Australia. So it was a very quick turnaround that might have been better if we had a little more time. But of course, the news wasn't going to wait. We had to go there as fast as possible because we were getting to that peak time of bushfire season.
I think Fernando, who also works for NBC, was just making a note in his notebook, no location out of bounds, and underlining it.
I wrote that one down. Thank you, Angie.
And Kim is making a note saying, do not come to me with these requests in my newsroom. So
no possibility.
None of you are leaving. So this piece was obviously the kickoff or the front end of something ongoing. So where do you go forward with weather and climate reporting from here? And specifically, what does this look like in a regular daily newscast instead of some very involved special report, such as this piece was quite long?
Yeah, that was a big lift for that piece. So obviously it's you know, you can't do that on a daily basis. So what I can do without taking a lot of resources from the newsroom, because let's be honest, I mean, it's COVID and it's just a regular newsroom where a lot of times the weather person, the meteorologist asking for a photog and all these other resources is going to get shot down. Now, they do give me those resources when it's a really good story that I need to tell, but there's a way that I can work them into my own weathercast without needing anything from anyone else. So myself and mainly 2 other meteorologists that are here at NBC6, we try to work those in. You know, we have tons of temperature records. We have, a lot going on with king tides. So there's numerous ways that we can kind of tell the story and advance our weather story while doing it. So we add those in, any little climate tidbits that we can in our regular, weathercast. They may be 2 minutes long, but we find some time for those. And I think viewers have responded to that. There's almost an interaction that we get a lot of times on social media, that people come to us and give us story ideas that have to do with climate, or, they're telling their friends, hey, this is the climate station. So we've really made a brand name for ourselves in the market. And I mean, essentially across the country with our NBC owned stations, that we are really passionate about climate, and we continue to tell the story, not just in our long form reporting, but in our daily weathercast as well.
What about pushback? Have you had any that you've had to deal with from viewers?
Yeah, I mean, there's always the conspiracy theorists, right? So where I worked previously in St. Joseph, Missouri, there was a lot more pushback for me there. But that was also 5 or 6 years ago. So I think that as a society, we've come a long way to kind of accepting it. Of course, it's a very politicized topic, but we just follow the facts. So I don't think that, most of the time there aren't people that are pushing back to me on the facts that I've displayed. You'll of course get, like I said, the conspiracy theorists that call me on my office phone or send me crazy emails, disputing what I'm saying. But for the most part, especially here in Miami, people have been very receptive of it and ask for more. And, especially after our Australia piece, they applauded what we were doing, and they noted that, wow, you guys really invested some time and money, obviously, in sending Angie there. And we appreciate that you're telling those stories and relating it back to what's going on in South Florida. So I don't think it goes unnoticed to the viewers either.
I want to put some questions to all of you collectively in some areas. The first of which is collaboration. We have extraordinary tools available to virtualize collaboration, but it's not the same as working side by side with your colleagues. So I'm wondering how you found the impediments to in-person collaboration, how they've affected your storytelling this year, and what have you learned from those impediments, or how have you adapted around them? Let's start with Fernando on that, please.
Yeah, so at NBCLX, we have a very MMJ on steroids model, and we call it storyteller because we really want it to be a holistic, like everything from pitching to budgeting to researching motion graphics, all that. We obviously have a motion graphics team that's very talented and they take care of like the bigger, more complex stuff. But before that, before the pandemic, we were already so spread out. We have big hubs in Dallas, LA, New York, and then we have storytellers in Miami, Chicago, I'm forgetting a few cities. So we were already kind of used to working in that tech space. Now when we moved home, it was even more, a little more, you had to kind of take care of more things than before. Even with our quality control process where we would send, 4 gigabyte master split MOV files to get color corrected and all that, we kind of had to learn how to do that. And I think all of us have kind of taken it upon ourselves to learn a little bit more After Effects. If not, at the bare minimum, get more familiar with the interface to do basic motion graphics work, color correcting. I think all of our shooting has improved. We've been able to shoot out in the field a little bit and kind of think even more outside of the box. That was already what we were being asked to do, but even more so now that we're filling 4 hours a day of news, linear news, and then doing at least like 1 to 2 features a day throughout the entire corps of storytellers. So
you've sharpened your solo act, it sounds like was the response.
Yeah, definitely.
So what about you, Angie?
I would say, it's funny because we work in a communication business, but sometimes we forget to communicate the little things. And this just really forced us to talk more, on all different kinds of mediums. We use Slack sometimes, obviously texting, the regular email, those kind of things. But I found that there needed to be a lot more communicated so you weren't missing the details of things. So you weren't, skipping a step that you thought someone else was doing. So I think for us, essentially, especially, even with stuff as small as our forecasting, I mean, when there's a meteorologist coming up next after you need to talk about what your plan is and what you see. So I think it just forced us to communicate more on all levels.
Mm-hmm. And Mayan, what about you? Are you sort of a lone wolf out in the field, or has your collaboration been impacted?
I would say it has. So I write, produce, report, do all that stuff by myself. I'm solo, but I do not shoot my own stuff. I don't edit it, and I don't do the animation. And so I'm very thankful for that support. And I think what's been most difficult, so we move, for long form, we turn pieces around, I turn them around pretty quickly. So it's probably less than 4 weeks for each piece from beginning to end. And maybe a week to 2 weeks of post-production. That's what I'm including in that time. And so even for that guns piece, Michael, who is the one who shot it, my colleague who shot it, we got on a Zoom call and he shared the screen, and for hours we're playing it and watching it together. That's the part that this pandemic, I think, for people who work a lot on teams and collaboratively have been very difficult. Like Angie just said with the communication, I'm very quick I'm not slacking. I'm like, so we're getting on the phone. Let's pretend like it's 1999. I'm calling you, let's do this, even if it's via Slack. Because it's not just the details, but also, and Fernando spoke to this earlier, when you have a vision for a piece and you're trying to bring, so I'm bringing the journalism and the news and the writing and that person and personality, but also I have someone who has a background in film, who has a different creative eye than I do, and how can we marry those two together and also bring in one of our animators are so lovely because they do so much on such a brief amount of time. How can we pull all these resources in together and make it work? So even on that piece, there was one day we were on the Zoom for Zoom fatigue. Fernando's correct. So that part, that's part that I do miss. The post-production part feels somehow much easier in person, but I have tried with when working in teams to recreate some of that to make it easier and also relieve that burden. Because I think one of the things we don't talk about in this business enough is this isolation has made the already invisible work more invisible, and then some work that we do absolutely invisible that we didn't realize we were seeing in newsrooms. And so I feel like the more we're more thoughtful about the interaction and how we work with one another, because then you can also have people on your team and offside your team also lobbying for you to say like, oh, hey, like, you know, Kim, I don't know if you know, but Kim did this part, right? You didn't see that, but that also went into this, and Angie did this, and Fernando did this. So I try to be mindful of that.
So Kim, you have to be mindful of an entire newsroom of people who are, most of them gone, working remotely. How have you managed that and to keep that collaborative spirit going, or has it just suffered? I mean, or have you found good workarounds?
You know, I'll just echo what Angie said. I mean, again, in a very odd way, it's forced us to communicate more. I mean, how many times have you ever heard, oh, we're in the communication business and we never communicate? I think we communicate more now, ironically, than we did before. You know, people are paired up in teams. So like photographers, the same photographer and reporter work with each other every day here. So they are constantly in communication with producers or assignment desk or, you know, managers about their stories and what have you. I didn't even know what a Zoom or a GoToMeetings or a Teams or whatever was, you know, this time last year. And I would venture to say that throughout the day, somebody's always on one of those type of things. I just knew FaceTime, but, you know, I'm not a technology whiz. So I think it's very ironic, but I think that the communication is even more so. You know, I also feel that it's been an opportunity where we have open editorial meetings here in our newsroom. I find that more people are joining the editorial meeting processes because they can do it from the comfort of their car, or they can do it from the comfort of their home. You know, people who maybe didn't, you know, the editorial meeting was before their shift began, they're joining those meetings. So I think that there's been an opportunity here where instead of less communication, it's actually been more communication. And do we have meetings where the entire newsroom is invited? Yeah, we have those, but I think that the daily interaction is really what has been upped more than anything else.
Okay, and this echoes what I've heard from news VP. Just yesterday, our panel of news VPs said the same thing, and I've heard CEOs say it as well. That they're able to cover more ground, have more conversations. We don't have a terrible much time left, so I want to hit a few other areas. Creative latitude is another one. I touched on it briefly before with Kim, but I'd like to go a little further. In the last year, the proliferation of streaming, the evolving relationship that you have with the audience as news storytellers is you know, further evolving. How much unshackling are we going to see from the conventions of news video storytelling, do you think? How much experimentation are we apt to see from an NBC, you know, NBC with LX, for instance, traditional news spaces like even the local newscast or the network news? Do you think that we have an audience and a moment and a confluence of circumstances that's made it ready to see more daily workaday experimentation? If everyone can just sort of touch on that briefly, starting with Angie.
Yeah, I think that, you know, I feel like I sit in meetings all the time, you know, especially before COVID, or I'm on Zoom meetings now, where we're trying to get millennials and we're trying to get Gen Zs to watch local news. And that's what I'll speak to, is just local news. I think that some of the creativity that we've seen unfold during COVID has brought maybe people that were kind of wary about being experimental like that. So I think that the creativity will stick, maybe not in as extreme measures, but I think there's something that, you know, people that have been in the industry for 30 years that maybe we're wary about are saying, oh, okay, I didn't think that would work, but let's stick with it. And I think that people are giving more latitude too, you know, just bosses and stuff. So I think personally, especially in my newsroom, it'll stick, especially if things have already proven to resonate with the audience. So for us, yeah, I think it'll stick beyond COVID times.
Sorry, Fernando and Mayans, do you think that it better stick, or just people are going to tune out? Both of you being sort of progressive.
I think there's a real appetite for visually stimulating stories, especially with the pandemic when everyone kind of like turned over to their TV at the same time. And it wasn't just competition with your DMA, but it was also you're competing with 7 other news outlets who are also doing the protest story at the same time. So how can you visually make it look different? So when they're switching the channel, they decide to give you 3 more seconds of consideration to state it.
Mm-hmm. What do you think?
For everyone watching this, I really want you to take this away. People have always been watching and consuming video and news. They never were consuming less of it. And so, like Angie said, and also Fernando, the experimentation is the time to really woo them in and get them acquainted with brands. AJ Plus pioneered text on video, and sorry for you and your Facebook feeds, but also not sorry, because it's why, you know, Kim and Angie and Fernando, it's part of the reason that I get to do the work that I'm doing today. And I do think that there has to be, if we plan to be relevant, I guess that's, you have to question if you plan to be relevant. We have to adapt and change and be creative, because if you think of it generationally, even if I know, like, you know, millennials are grown, which is the other thing. So, and also like they're working Gen Z people in newsrooms right now. So when we talk about these people, I think sometimes we're not thinking about how they came to be and saw the evolution of news and how they like grew up with it. And I think the appetite is 1,000% there. And it's our opportunity to speak to them in ways that they know. In the same way that I wouldn't tell you a news story, hey, Black people are buying guns, because, you know, it's not, we're not doing the Charleston. Like, what do those stories look like in this 21st century, in 2021 for these audiences? I'm very excited about like us adapting and doing all these things. And
Kim, is it adapt or die?
No, I think you're seeing the creativity left and right. And I think that it is given a renewed spirit to journalists. And I think it is the creativity has increased the personal pride and ownership that people have in their stories. And I think that you're seeing that across the board. And I think you're seeing that in audiences as well.
Mm-hmm. Well, since we're running out of time, I only really have time for one quick question with everybody. I want to ask you about your favorite tools that you have adopted this year, whether it's in terms of newsroom communication or tools in your actual storytelling. So if we can start with Mayans.
I have 2. So this, obviously, my phone is my favorite tool, which I think people don't consider technology, but not only does it allow me to keep in touch with my colleagues, but literally I do all of the work. And I don't just mean like texting, but also, you know, the old school way of picking up the phone and like working the phones, which we don't talk enough about. In terms of visuals, my favorite thing, even though I don't use it, is the gimbal, because it allows photographers to move very quickly, like when you're out in the field and moving on stories, which often I am, but then maintain a steady picture. I know some people like the aesthetic of like moving a whole bunch around. I don't necessarily love that, but you get like the movement with the smoothness, and also you can be here and there and everywhere. So I love the gimbal. Okay,
just in the seconds left, Fernando, what's yours?
Screen record for sure, so underutilized. And then After Effects. I think there's so many simple things you can do in there. Just literally spend 15 minutes and you'll be surprised with what you can do.
Angie?
Mine's more of something I'm excited to use. You know, we've just invested in AR, so I think it'll be really good to tell my story and help visually explain some of the more complex stuff when it comes to climate and environmental reporting.
And you and I should have another conversation about that sometime soon in TV News Check. And finally, the last word to you, Kim.
Yes. I mean, I will tell you, this is a lifesaver in what we do every single day, both from a technology standpoint, from a storytelling standpoint, and from a communication standpoint. Was it valuable before? Yes, but this is the most important tool outside of the traditional tools that we have.
Okay, excellent. I'm so sorry to have to cut it off here, but we have come up against our time. Thank you so much to all of you for sharing your excellent work with us today, which again, we will link in our story tomorrow. And thanks for a great discussion. Good luck with your work going into next year.
Thank you.
Thanks, Michael.
Thank you.